Welcome back to Powered by Play. I'm Drew, and I'm a professor of theater at Chapman University in Southern California.
I'm Avery, and I'm a theatrical scenic designer. Every month on this podcast, we explore what we play, how we play, and why we play.
We believe play powers us, and that's what makes it powerful.
All right, Drew.
All right, Avery.
Press play.
This time on Powered by Play, we are discussing playing heroes and villains. Heroes and villains are the cornerstone of epic storytelling, and have been from the very beginning of when stories were told. And maybe they're around in real life as well. But Avery and I want to investigate what makes a hero, what makes a superhero, what makes a villain, and how do we play them and play with them to figure out how we should navigate our own heroism and villainy. I wanted to start with a quote from the Ramayana, which is the Hindu epic that explains what it means to be good, what it means to be heroic. It's a guide for ethical behavior or behavior that conforms to your given path, your dharma. And in this section, the sage is telling a tale about Rama. And so here is how the sage is described. He sang of Rama's princely birth, his kindness and heroic worth, his love for all, his patient youth, his gentleness and constant truth. And here, I think, is the very beginning of a conception of what makes a hero, what makes someone who is worthy of leadership or worthy of great deeds. So I just want to point out a few things here. Born a prince, so born into privilege, which was an aspect of several kind of early heroes, the nobleness and the assumption that nobility meant you were going to be worthy of leadership. Kindness, heroic worth, love, patience, gentleness, and constant truth. And even though Rama is going to be fighting in this story, it's sort of hinted at the warrior aspect, heroic worth, but there's nowhere in here, I think, and I think this is important, is there something about strength or mightiness in battle, or willingness to go after bad people, or anything like that. And I think that's kind of interesting in this very, very beginning of what we tell ourselves, what in those times in the subcontinent of India they were saying about who they valued. I think it's also interesting in England, kids usually call heroes and villains goodies or baddies. That's sort of their version of good guy or bad guy. And I think this kind of sets up how audiences today think of heroes and villains as well. Who do we want to be the one to get the good things in the story? Who's on our side? And how can we tell that they're on our side? And how do we play through what it means to be that hero facing down villains? And Avery, I think we learned this from a very, very early age. What about your childhood? Who were some favorite heroes or villains, or how did you, in the very beginning, understand what this was all about?
I think my earliest exposure to heroism and such was definitely from cartoons and from TV shows and movies. And one of my favorites was Violet from The Incredibles, partly because maybe she just had long hair and had other siblings, and I related to having to deal with like my chaotic siblings and my parents who they didn't understand me. I was a teenager, and how Violet in this movie has control over being invisible made me kind of admire that and envy that, and also fantasize about that too, of being able to control how and when you're perceived as a teenager, especially, is really cool to imagine. I also had a lot of just ensemble cartoon shows as my favorite, such as Teen Titans. My favorite character was Raven, and I liked how she was moody, dark, and not overly feminine, as sometimes other cartoons like to really draw out the feminine aspects of their female characters just to be like, oh, this is a girl, so that girls can relate to them. But because I wasn't really somebody who wanted to be feminine at all growing up, I really related to this kind of character, especially also with Toph from Avatar the Last Airbender, who's a very short, small, blind girl who actually becomes the strongest earthbender in the entire world. And Toph is also very much a tomboy and tough and doesn't really let her small size or her blindness get in the way of her being a complete badass. And also because I am currently 4'11 and I was always the shortest person in class, I also really admired that somebody of such a small height and also who was from an Asian inspired story could also be such a freaking badass. Another one of my favorites was Sailor Moon. My sister and I loved to just roleplay the characters from there. I loved Sailor Mercury, who has the blue short hair, because her qualities is that she's smart. She has really cool glasses that have like magical technical powers, and also just overall the color blue, which is my favorite color too, which is such a simple thing to relate to in a character, but it was true. And I also liked Sailor Jupiter because she was also a tomboy as well. You can kind of see a common theme going on, Drew.
Yes, I see it.
There was also Cyber Chase, which was very like techno cyber themed for kids, and these kids save the internet like world with their problem solving skills and their deduction, and they get to explore around the universe with different like themes like ancient Egypt or Greece or whatever. I also really liked these common themes in these shows of like adventuring around and exploring and just having really interesting days. I think as a privileged kid growing up in the suburbs of California, I had a pretty normal life, and being able to live out these adventures with these really cool characters who either had superpowers or just had really exceptional qualities about them made me feel kind of empowered, and I was able to see myself in them while not actually getting sucked into a computer and then recruited to save a motherboard from, hackers and stuff like that. Another favorite of more recent times has been She-Ra in the Princesses of Power animation. It has a very diverse cast of mostly female heroes. There's a lot of queer representation, not just in like, oh, I am gay, but more so like my gender expression doesn't really confine to femininity or masculinity, and there's also lots of characters who might be feminine in their own ways, and some of them who just have like a lot of really interesting backstories that, it's just like very well defined female characters basically. And that seems like such a simple thing to like about a show, but it's true. Like growing up, I wasn't really exposed to that kind of diversity in terms of like the female characters. Like even with like for example Teen Titans, there were two females in the group of five, right? And like one of them super feminine and one of them's not super feminine. And that was kind of like the two options of being raised female that you could have growing up. But instead, with a show with many more female characters and even male characters who break gender binaries, that is something that I wish that I had seen as a child, but am glad that exists now for people and children to experience now. But overall, I find a lot of themes of empathizing with certain characters. As you can also see, you can kind of tell if you didn't know anything about me and you just heard me explain to you my favorite childhood heroes in cartoons, you would understand more about me now as a result. And it makes a lot of sense that the media that we watch is tailored to what society thinks that we should be able to relate to. And for better or for worse, usually, fortunately, they allow us to relate to the good guys and the heroes who are doing good in the world. So, how much of this do you relate to, Drew? And what kinds of media did you have growing up?
I relate to a lot of it. Absolutely. Especially Toph.
Yeah.
Go Toph.
Yeah.
Fan favorite. I loved Toph and Uncle
Oh,
Iroh
yeah.
are my two beloved characters from Avatar the Last Airbender. Something tells me we might hear a little bit later about another character from Avatar the Last Airbender, but yeah, totally get that. All right. When I was a kid, I was, yes, definitely cartoons, also literature, children's literature, and also Steven Spielberg movies and George Lucas movies were huge when I was a kid. So this is the time of the original Star Wars trilogy. This is the time of, oh gosh, E.T. and Goonies and all those sort of like kids on adventures, Stranger Things esque Spielberg movies or Spielberg inspired movies. But the one that I really related to was Professor Indiana Jones, Professor Henry Jones Jr., known as Indiana Jones. So, and I know, today we look at this character and we say there are some problematic elements. In the first movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's sort of suggested that he may have had an inappropriate relationship with Marion Ravenwood when she was a little young to have that relationship. A lot of people see him as kind of a Tomb Raider or a white savior kind of figure. We're going to talk about white saviors a little later too. But here's how I saw him, and here's what I want to put forward for Dr. Jones here. The first thing is that he was smart. He was a professor. He studied. He studied ancient cultures, and he knew about ancient cultures in a way that other characters did not. In fact, he was a university professor, a teacher, and I don't doubt that in some very small way, possibly larger way, what I do for a living right now has to do with thinking that being a professor was just this wonderful job. I don't know if I thought that every professor was going to be able to go on rip-roaring adventures and go travel all over the world, although because I teach theater from cultures around the world, I do travel around the world, and that's one of my favorite things about what I get to do. But Indiana Jones was smart, knowledgeable, capable, cognizant of culture. He understood and respected different cultures. And in fact, there are a lot of sections that his respect for a culture is what keeps him safe or what allows him to progress. So things like respecting that the small village in India where he is in Temple of Doom is giving him and his companions the food that they have for a long period of time, or his famous line, that belongs in a museum. Yes, okay, museums are a whole other thing, but he wants to make sure that artifacts are not in the hands of rich collectors or people who steal from cultures. He wants them to belong to everybody. All right, so yes, I am somehow being an apologist for Indiana Jones, but this is what I found so compelling about him as a kid. The other child character well, Indiana Jones isn't a child. The child character that I really related to was Lucy Pevensey from the Chronicles of Narnia, and most famous for in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe being the first of the siblings to go through the wardrobe and discover Narnia and make friends with Mr. Tumnus the Fawn. Lucy was curious. Her curiosity was her strength. And she was kind, and she was truthful. She was telling the truth about Narnia, and no matter who didn't believe her, she was going to tell the truth and say what she knew to be true. And she was always looking for the light, always looking for what is the right thing to do, how can I help? And That I thought was incredibly compelling, and I wanted to adventure through a fantastical land like Lucy. Also, okay, Avery, the Dungeons and Dragons alignment chart. Is this something that you were into when you were a kid?
More so as a adult, yes.
Okay, all right. So I found this fascinating when I was a kid. I got into D&D probably around age 7, and off and on I was into it all the way through to today. The alignment chart and trying to figure out what is the difference between someone who is lawful and someone who is good. And all these different permutations. So, for those of our listeners who are not aware, the Dungeons and Dragons alignment chart has 9 different alignments that are a combination of lawful, neutral, and chaotic. So that's kind of like, how do you relate to laws and the dictates of society? Good, neutral, and evil. And that is more about your moral center. Are you in general altruistic? Do you want to help people? Or in general, are you more self focused? Are you more about, I'm going to see who I can bring down on my climb to the top? And so, with all of those different combinations, the alignment that is formed on that sort of matrix helps you play your character and also gives the dungeon master an idea of how their non player characters, including their villains, are going to kind of interact with the world. I thought that was fascinating as a kid. And I sometimes would look at heroes and villains in literature and say, oh, I wonder if are they chaotic evil or are they lawful evil? And what does that say about them? So those were sort of my loves in childhood. And yes, I did walk around imagining that I was Indiana Jones. Okay, listeners, I am admitting this to you in front of everybody. I did attempt to use my belt as a whip, and I believe that I hurt myself while doing so, but I absolutely 100% wanted a bullwhip that would behave like Indiana Jones' bullwhip behaved, and it did not quite. I was not able to wrap it around things and swing from them, but it was a lot of fun to kind of carry by my side. So that
Wow.
was my heroes and villains. But all right, Avery, now that
Yeah.
perhaps we are a little older, but those children still live within us, what do you think when you think of a hero or a superhero?
Well, I tend to think about their origin story because that's probably the most important thing about a hero is why they are a hero. So sometimes you could be chosen by other beings, like in Sailor Moon, where this little teenager girl was chosen by a goddess who turned into a cat to find her inner strength and defeat evil beings. And even though Usagi, which is the name of the civilian character who becomes Sailor Moon, even though Usagi is a complete crybaby, whiny, lazy girl at the beginning of this series, even at the end of the first episode, she has to stop crying for just a second in order to find her inner strength and defeat a monster that's threatening the innocent civilians around her. Another reason you might become a hero is maybe you have special gifts and maybe you want to use them for good. So, in the Chinese tale of Hou Yi, he's a seasoned archer and he's chosen by the emperor to shoot some of the 10 suns that are all coming out at once. So, backstory about the universe, in case you didn't know, there used to be 10 suns in the sky, all taking turns each day, but then one day they all come out to play at once, which causes a lot of destruction on Earth. So Hou-Yi, this archer, is tasked to shoot them all down, but he leaves one alive, and that's why we have just one sun. The end. Even in The Incredibles, people are born with superpowers, and even when these superheroes are outlawed by the government, a lot of them still want to fight crime secretly anyway. Also reminds me of X-Men, where sometimes you become a mutant because of some certain event that happens to you, and you use those gifts that you obtain afterwards, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's because of your heritage, like in the Invincible animated show. Mark Grayson is the son of Omni-Man, who's the most powerful superhero in the world. And I'll talk more about that later, but he has the opportunity to follow in the steps of good or the steps of evil. Another reason you might be a hero is that it's just your job. Like in the Totally Spies kids cartoon, 3 regular teenage girls become employees as spies with special gadgets, and they're sent out to missions around the world to stop evil. And then they make it home in time to flirt with high school guys and chill out at their what is it, Beverly Hills apartment house that they somehow can afford as teenagers. Another final reason that you might become a hero is that you experienced a bad event and you have to respond to it. So, in the book Iron Widow by Shirin J. Zhao, which is a young adult science fantasy novel, the world has these mechanical robots that can fight these other aliens. And basically, the protagonist, Zetian, resolves to assassinate the male mecha pilot who's responsible for her sister's death. Simple enough, and it's straightforward enough that the audience can really understand why this person is going out of her way to face a ton of danger and really high stakes just to achieve her mission. And even in Big Hero 6, the animated movie, Hero's big brother Tadashi dies in a fire, and Hero has the chance to capture the culprit, which sends him and his grad school friends on a journey to save the world and use their smarts to create their own suits and fight evil. And the message of Big Hero 6 is not only that you have control over how you respond to things that you find upsetting in the world, but also that you need your friends and your community in order to be more basically powerful, but to basically be more empowered in itself. And I think Big Hero 6 is such a great example of like a young superhero movie for children, is that it centers your community and your team rather than just centering that you alone have the job to do everything. So it's very inspiring and it's such a feel-good movie. I rewatched it recently, shed some more tears, and really enjoyed it. But yeah, aside from an origin story, Drew, what do you think makes up a hero or a superhero?
And wow, those are some great stories. I really was fascinated by the idea of, can one person be a hero alone, or must they always have companions with them? And I agree that this is something that we've been kind of exploring back and forth. I think in the very, very early days, a hero was someone who you were supposed to emulate because they had everything within themselves. Except a lot of heroes did have companions. Gilgamesh had a companion, and there were definitely heroes who had companions. But I think for the people who were listening, they wanted to emulate the hero rather than the companion, which is kind of a fascinating idea. But I mean, in these days, the Fellowship of the Ring, or Harry Potter, or Big Hero 6, the idea that you could not do it alone. There is just no way. I think it's something to really track. It's also something for kids to wonder about when they're playing. If I am playing this character by myself, like if I were playing Luke Skywalker as a kid, right? Would I want to be Luke Skywalker on his own taking his X-Wing to other planets, or would I want Luke standing beside Leia and Han and Chewbacca and maybe Obi-Wan, and would I want them all assembled in the Millennium Falcon flying from planet to planet? That's a great thing to kind of watch and see how that goes down in both ways. I did look up the etymology of the word hero, and the word comes from a Greek word that refers to a protector or a defender. And the idea with this Greek term was that it was a role that someone played. And it was supposed to be played by the best suited person. So the probably the best example is Hercules or Heracles later, right? The only person who could have done this, or Jason, the only person who could have led the Argonauts. And this reminded me of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Anyone could wear the mask. You could wear the mask, Miles Morales says in the very end of the first movie. And that's sort of fascinating. Who is best suited? I looked at a bunch of tales from the Middle East, and when I was a kid, here's another whole selection of tales that I loved. I had this beautifully illustrated Arabian Tales of the Arabian Nights book, and I loved that book. I loved in particular the tale of Ali Baba and his servant Morgana and all of her wit and ingenuity, and she kind of does the killing for Alibaba, which I thought was fascinating. But the idea that we have heroes like Sinbad and Aladdin and a whole other assortment of folks, and these guys who were not all in the original sort of tales that were collected, but were added later in different versions of the Thousand and One Nights Tales of the Arabian Nights collections. They were all kind of ruffians. I mean, they were just kind of regular people a lot of the time. They might be thieves, or they might just kind of be out for glory or whatever it was, and they succeed, and they wildly succeed. They marry into royalty, or they find caves of wonder, they get wishes, they get all these things because they, in their scrappiness, they have something that allows them to see better than the people who already typically have wealth and privilege. And this is interesting because if we look at who the actual hero is in all these stories, if we look at the frame story, it's Scheherazade. And Scheherazade is the woman who is telling the stories and then leaving off at an exciting part every night so that she will not be put to death by the misogynistic Shahryar. And she, because of her wit and her ingenuity and her care for her sister and the other women who live in the kingdom, is going to tell stories, not stab the Shah, not raise an army, nothing like not poison anybody, but tell stories. And because she tells the stories and she tells them beautifully, and she wins the trust of Shahryar, she saves all of the women in her kingdom, and she turns around the misogynistic nature of her husband. And so, who is the real hero? I think at the end of the day, the hero is the one who is telling the stories, which I always thought was pretty fascinating. So, from hero to villain, Avery, what do you think? Who are those baddies that we love to hate?
The first one that comes to mind is Team Rocket from Pokemon. So when I think of villains, I feel like it's defined by the character's pattern of actions. Usually it involves cruelty, harmful selfishness, greed, a lack of remorse, and just systematically inflicting pain upon other people. So Team Rocket from the cartoon and video games Pokemon, they're notoriously, well, they're comedic villains, and so they end up being not much more than a nuisance or a subplot or fun ways for my siblings and I to replay the funniest moments from their schemes later on, and just have that be the end of the day. Like every episode in Pokemon, Team Rocket comes in to try to steal Pikachu or try to steal a different rare Pokemon, and then they get blasted away forever. And then they come back the next episode and you're like, look, it's them again, but you're not really surprised or anything. And so I think they're a great example of that kind of comedic, repeatable villain. Whereas when you encounter Giovanni, who is actually the head of Team Rocket and who Jesse and James are actually who they report to, now that's a much more sinister character. I think the first time that you are introduced to Giovanni's character in Pokemon, he's like cloaked in shadow. His eyes are like triangles, or like you don't even see his eyes at first, and then like slowly the cartoon reveals him to you. But his goal is to capture all the rarest Pokemon, and he's like a truly dangerous villain in the show because he's the one pulling all the strings. He's the one, causing and controlling his underlings to do his bidding for him. And that was probably one of my favorite, layers of villainy growing up because without even realizing it, I was learning about what it means to be a true villain. Because I didn't really feel threatened by Team Rocket. I knew that they were the villains, but I didn't really feel afraid of them. But when you went up a couple layers of authority, that's when the cartoon was like, all right, take them seriously. These are who you should actually be afraid of. A game that can always also remind me of Pokemon is Undertale, which I have talked about a couple times. It's a little RPG computer game or video game that you, as the character of a human who falls into the underground, which is a world of monsters, you are basically trying to escape and you encounter all these monsters, and you can either kill them, leave them all alive, or do a mix of killing some and then leaving others alive. But this game really challenges the player's assumption of what their role as a protagonist is in a video game. So, do all these monsters have to die just because they encounter you and they're monsters? Is that their only reason that you need to kill them? What if these monsters are actually quirky and innocent? And what if they actually have personalities, likes, and lives, and jobs, and families of their own? Because the first time that you actually kill anything in Undertale, the game makes you realize that you killed a innocent being, and it makes you feel instant regret for it. I know so many people who killed the first monster and then they immediately restarted the game because they felt so much remorse over doing so. And so this goes back again to the pattern of actions of killing innocent beings. Do you continue to kill innocent beings throughout this game, even after the game itself portrays this as wrong and harmful and sinister? And you can, and then you can see how it plays out. You can become the villain of this game, and you can see how the other monsters react to you, and slowly start to become more and more afraid of you, and could even discourage you from, continuing to pursue all of this patterns of killing monsters. Another way to be a villain is to be a chaotic goose, like in Untitled Goose Game, which is another video game. You are basically just a goose, and you cause mischief and chaos, but there's no killing in this game. Your only goal is just to make the humans around you have a bad day. And I think that is such a lovely way to play out your villainy, if that's the kind for you. And it's a simple comedic way also to portray villainy because it's also playing with perspective. Usually we default to relating to human characters, but because we get to play out a fantasy of being an evil goose, we get to kind of let out that part of ourselves that relates to causing chaos and that relates to, wanting to just be chaotic and not necessarily be lawful in the way that we have to be lawful outside in society all the time. And another thing that I have encountered recently is with reality TV, such as dating shows or survival shows, which are basically glorified social experiments. Basically, a lot of these shows, and what a lot of reality TV shows have in common, is that certain characters become the villain. They're portrayed less sympathetically, and they're part of this system of the audience rooting for different characters on the TV show. And whereas the true villain, if the participants of this show actually like looked up around them, the true villain is actually the producers who are pitting the characters against each other, who are encouraging certain things, who are even scripting certain moments to make these quote unquote real people become quote unquote villains or quote unquote heroes. The drama of this all is the purpose of it. The producers and the designers, the creators of this reality TV show want drama, and so they're going to manipulate the participants in a way that creates that. And even the way that the sets are built is that there's often no corners for someone to hide, or like in Love is Blind, you're closed off in isolated intimacy, and then you're thrust into these big open, spaces of group time, and then you throw them back into the world when they get married. And it's just like all these elements of physically isolating people, but emotionally exposing them so that you get the most of the drama that you have. And I think this is also the case for most of our stories and most of our media, most of our games, is that if you have a good guy, you have a bad guy. This is like the premise of writing a story, writing any screenplay. You have a protagonist and you have an antagonist. And that antagonist is going to be the antagonist because you have the protagonist. Like it's a yin and yang situation. You have to have one in order to have the strengths of the other be amplified. So yeah, what do you think, Drew?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I thought when you were talking about throwing reality TV people into sort of with the lights on them and with the cameras watching, I thought of like the old gladiator arenas with everybody encircling the gladiators. There's no place to hide. There's no place to get away from the other combatants. So that was sort of interesting.
Wasn't it that the gladiators themselves were prisoners who
Yes.
were forced to fight for, either to keep living or for entertainment, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so as the audience, you either are like, yeah, I hope the gladiator wins, or yeah, I hope the lion wins.
Yeah,
But none of them are looking at the emperor and saying that the emperor is the real villain here, because that's the person or the government that's making this happen in the first place.
precisely. Yeah, no, it was for the entertainment of the people who were assembled, and there was an assumption that this is what would entertain them. I just think of Russell Crowe as Maximus going, "Are you not entertained?" and shaking his fist at the assembled people. Yeah. I also thought when you were chatting about kind of who is the antagonist, I think that there are some interesting examples of when we as the audience realize that it's kind of us. We are the antagonist. For example, I recently saw a reading of a play by a buddy of mine, Jose Casas. Shout out to Jose. Hey, hope you're listening. And Jose's play was a play about kids who are on Skid Row in LA, and they are waiting for a bed to be made available at the shelter across the street. And it's called Waiting because it's sort of reflective of Waiting for Godot. The two kids are talking to each other and just saying, "Hey, is somebody going to come and help us out? And why are these cars driving by us? Why does everybody just drive by? Do they not see us? Do they not realize that we need help?" And I think slowly we realize as the audience that we are the people in the cars who drive by the kids sitting on Skid Row. We are the people who they're waiting for. We are the people who could help them, and we often don't. And we are, in many ways, the antagonists. We are antagonizing what they are trying to achieve. They are trying to achieve safety and security and the basic things that a lot of us take for granted: a roof over our heads, enough to eat, the ability to go and see a doctor if we need one, and these kids, and just basic safety. And these kids don't have that. And so in some ways, we are the reason that they don't have it, because we are not willing to give them what they would need. I also looked up the etymology again for the word villain, and it comes from a Latin word that basically means someone who is bound to an estate, someone who worked the land. And the reason that that was associated with evil or badness was that those people in society were not knightly. They were not virtuous. There was no virtue expected of them. And this also has connections to the word vile. And in the Middle Ages, vile meant wicked or worthless. So you put all this stuff together kind of in a blender and you get villain. Some villains, some memorable villains that I picked out from the Western canon are characters like Hannibal Lecter, Darth Vader, the Joker, and oh my goodness, the Joker is a villain of many layers. Nurse Ratched in All Flew Over, or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Dracula, Richard III in Shakespeare, and I'll have a little more to say about him later on. And then there are some villains that have become characters to be understood and sort of characters that they have been reversed. We are trying to understand them as the heroes of their own story, because I know there's a typical sort of saying that nobody is a villain, they're all heroes of their own story, right? So the villain thinks that they are doing the right thing. And of course, right now, Avery, we are in the throes of Wicked mania. And so Wicked, trying to understand Elphaba, who was, and I just learned this, I was this year old when I learned that Gregory Maguire, who wrote the original book, actually created her name out of L. Frank Baum's name, the author
Oh,
of the...
wow.
I know! And so the author of the original Wizard of Oz, he created Elphaba out of his name. So trying to understand why Elphaba eventually became the character of the Wicked Witch of the West, and that's what the book is all about, the musical, etc. Cruella, trying to understand the shift in Cruella de Vil and how she became who she was. And this was one that I was kind of like, really, Disney? You're going to try and make me understand a woman who wants puppy skins for a coat? But doggone it. Hey, no pun intended. Doggone it. They made me understand what was behind Cruella's actions. Of course, Anakin, how Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader. So there's this interesting question of, do we need to understand? Do we need the stories? Is trying to understand the backstory of a villain and how they became a villain worthwhile? All those questions. Sometimes it's clear that a villain is a villain, and sometimes it's kind of a gray area, like in Killing Eve. Is Villanelle a villain? Is Eve a villain? When you talked about the first kill, when Eve makes that first kill in Killing Eve, do you suddenly see her as a villain? Or do you still see it's this sort of, talk about yin and yang. That whole series is really fascinating in how it sort of, who is a villain and who is a hero in a moment. And then sometimes villains seem to be used as boogeymen to teach children what not to do or not to be. Mexico, of course, has a couple of examples. The villains La Llorona and El Cucuy. Don't stay out late, kids. Don't do things other than what your parent says, or you could be snatched. And then sometimes there are villains who are hiding in plain sight. This is the case in Agatha Christie's And Then There Were Known. And sorry, folks, if you haven't seen season 1 of Squid Game, this is the case in season 1 of Squid Game. The villain is there and is pulling the strings from the call is coming from inside the house sort of thing. I have heard, and I'll toss this to you, Avery. What do you think? Do you like watching a hero or a villain more? Do you like playing a hero or a villain more? What about being a dungeon master versus a player? The dungeon master, of course, gets to play all the roles, including the monsters and villains. Is there something that's more compelling about being in the shoes of someone who is doing bad things?
That's a really wonderful question. I remember the first time that I played a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, I had a character who was lawful good, partly because I wanted to play with that and see how that would turn out. All the other players, though, had chaotic like chaotic good or chaotic evil or chaotic neutral. And so I think I was the only lawful character and then the only lawful and good character. And I had trouble justifying why they would fight anything or steal anything or get any loot at all. And I I'm sure I'm sure there are people out there who have played lawful good characters and made it really interesting, but it was also my first campaign, so I was also learning how it worked. And I think as I've played more games that allow me to make choices, such as Skyrim, Disco Elysium, I recently started playing Baldur's Gate, and I've also played Divinity Original Sin 2. Like, there are a lot of these games that allow you to side with good or evil and do it in chaotic or lawful or good or neutral ways. And nowadays, I really resonate with um the side of villains a little bit more, especially as an adult, especially as somebody who's going through grad school, has lived on their own for a while, has come face to face with how this country doesn't really give us free health insurance, that makes us work ourselves to the bone, that makes us sacrifice ourselves and our passions for the cause of capitalism and for survival. And I think that is I'm pretty confident that that's a huge reason as to why a lot of adults also resonate with villains too, is that we are the ones who've come face to face with what the reality of this world is like. And the villains in these stories get to counter that. They are the ones who are taking action, who are dressing as boldly as they want, such as Cruella does, and they're the ones who take no stuff from others. They're the ones who are in control of their fates, and I think that's what draws me a lot to them.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think that that freedom and that colorfulness, I'm thinking of the Joker here, right? And
yeah.
there are, oh my gosh, after Heath Ledger played the Joker, I cannot even count the number of people who dressed up as that version of the Joker, who tried to do the Heath Ledger voice. Okay, yes, I too am guilty. Okay, I'll do it. Fine. And you want to know how I got these scars? Well, let me tell you. Okay,
Yeah,
that was a
that was
bad Heath
great.
Ledger.
No, that was
Um,
amazing.
I mean, look, he wears makeup. He's a guy and he wears makeup, and that is freedom. He's a guy who wears green and purple, and that is freedom. He's a guy who sets an entire pyramid of cash on fire, and that is freedom. But I think then you look at the Joker and you say, okay, but what about when he starts killing innocent people? Right? And I think perhaps when we play villain, we play this far and no farther, right? It helps us understand where is the line between sort of, we talked about this when we talked about the carnivalesque and rebellion and being naughty. Where is the line between naughtiness and evil? And I think that sort of looking at a villain and saying how far into that villain's sense of the world do you go? Maybe that's what is interesting.
Yep, absolutely.
And not to get too political here, but here we are in January of 2025, and the election that was held in November. There are many, 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 many people who had the response of the bad guy won. And there are many people who sort of looked at what happened and said, how did this happen? How did someone who many people like think that President-elect Trump is an evil person. I mean, and will call out aspects of his behavior and aspects of the things that he says and say, look, this is clearly evil. The man is a villain. And honestly, with a lot of things that they are calling out, I don't disagree. If you look at what makes a villain, what makes somebody who is a bad guy, and who is the person maybe that kids are supposed to look up to, the President of the United States. We have also just lost former President Jimmy Carter. And so a lot of the language around kind of the mourning of President Carter was he was a good man. He may not have been the best president, but he was a good man. And trying to figure out what is part of the role of the president. Does the president of the United States have to be a hero? Can the president of the United States be someone who people see as a villain? And if so, how? What is the role of the president? What are they supposed to do for us? But that is a conversation that I have been seeing a lot, especially as we move forward toward the inauguration.
Maybe Trump will have a redemption arc, since that's our next topic
Hey,
of
nice,
discussion.
nice segue, Avery. Okay, all
One can
right.
only
Redemption
hope.
arcs.
Yeah, maybe
Yes, one
Trump
can
will
only hope.
look at, I don't know, Zuko and Avatar the Last Airbender, and maybe Trump will be like, ah, yes, no, I realize the stuff that of which I've done, of which certain items I regret, and now I will choose to live my life a different way, and my actions will prove that. But I don't know. That's a really wonderful commentary, Drew, that I wholeheartedly agree with. But yeah, while we're discussing heroes and villains, there's always there's always the question of transforming into a hero, transforming into a villain. There's anti-heroes. Are there anti-villains? Actually, yeah, I think anti-villains, even though that's not really a commonly said word, I
Yeah,
think
no.
characters, when we do learn of their backstories and such, the more that we understand their backstories, and how sometimes they're quote unquote forced into their villainous actions, that creates a different narrative around them. But
Hmm. Maybe
so
Professor Snape?
yeah,
Would
how
would he would he fit the bill, do you think?
yeah, of being an anti-villain, and then
Yeah.
he sort of somewhat has a redemption arc in the end too. Um, but yeah, one of the most notorious redemption arcs for a villain is Zuko in Avatar, where his father, the Fire Lord, sent him on a hopeless chase. Well, after causing him physical abuse and public humiliation, sent Zuko on a hopeless chase to capture the Avatar, causing Zuko to basically see the Avatar, Aang, a 112-year-old little kid, as the only way to reclaim his honor, and, harming tons of people in the meantime. But Zuko himself matures when he realizes that his father was actually the true enemy the whole time, that his father was the one that had no right to basically abuse him, to basically abuse, tons of countries of people and cause complete global stress and danger and commit genocide. And and so the journey that Zuko goes on is also similar to the journey that Catra goes on in the 2018 cartoon She-Ra, where Adora and Catra are the main childhood friends who are both raised by a guardian called Shadow Weaver. And Shadow Weaver shows absolute favoritism to Adora, but publicly humiliates Catra at the same exact time in front of Adora, and just causes these two best friends to go down really different paths, where Adora becomes like the protagonist, the hero, the glowing sword bearer, and Catra becomes the leader of an army and destroys people and kingdoms, and until she realizes that it's destroying Catra herself. And it's ultimately the friendship of these two that kind of brings them back together and draws Catra back into the world of good, the world of healing, and the world of protecting the world. And it takes so much pain and strife to kind of come to this redemption conclusion. A third example would also be Jinx from the series Arcane, where Jinx is abandoned by her older sister Vi, basically, and then adopted by Silco, who is the villain character of the show in season 1. And kind of there's also this the question of what's that philosophical question of, are we inherently good or evil? I think sometimes shows take this as, they start us out as an innocent character, an innocent person, such as Jinx in Arcane at the beginning, and then these traumatic things happen. So she's abandoned, and then she's adopted by a villain. And so this is kind of an argument of like, well, your external circumstances can like affect who you become. And then it's not until season 2, spoilers warning, that Vi and Jinx do team up again to save their dad, and ultimately Jinx supports the good guys again and becomes a hero again. But I think what these three shows kind of have in common with their redemption arcs is that it's not only the external circumstances that affect the redeeming characters, the persona. It's also their internal. It's a combination of their external circumstances that teach them that what they're doing is wrong, but it's also a combination of internally there is something inherently in them that realizes that what they're doing is wrong. And so then there's other villains like Azula in Avatar, where she doesn't really have that internal system of, oh, wait, there's something telling me that I'm doing something wrong. That's why Azula is a much less quote unquote redeemable character, is because she does not develop any remorse for her harmful actions. She does not develop any restraint for causing damage and pain to other people. And so I think through these stories, and it's such an interesting element of like play. We're just playing through stories, right? But we're also teaching people of all ages of what it means to combine your external and internal circumstances to be a good person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good question to ask is, without Uncle Iroh, would Zuko have had the redemption arc? Because
Absolutely.
Uncle Iroh, as you say, Zuko has to change, his heart has to change, right? Before his actions can change and his frame for himself. And his catalyst for his heart changing is his uncle constantly asking him, "Who are you, Prince Zuko? Who do you want to be?" Right? And
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. Well, there's another villain who turns into a hero, sort of one of our archetypal ones, and that is Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. And so, or rather than an Uncle Iroh, he has four spirits. Some people, have you seen this thing about only 3 ghosts visit Scrooge? No, 4 ghosts, 4 spirits visit Scrooge. Marley, the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And they challenge him. They challenge him because in the beginning he's rich. I mean, he has a successful business going, and he also is on his own and does not really feel like he wants anyone else in his life. He sees his employee Bob Cratchit, and he sees his nephew Fred, and they just kind of are not of interest to him. His main goal is to make money and be by himself. And he also looks at people who are asking him for money and asking him to be a hero because he has money, and they're asking him to donate. Can you help the people who are without this Christmas? And Scrooge looks at him and he says, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" I mean, he basically says, "Why should I spend money on these people who are not worth it?" And Avery, I'm telling you, I see Ebenezer Scrooge in some conservative talking points every single year. Like, why are they incapable of doing something for themselves? And that's a whole other story. But through his experiences and through looking at the very human nature of life, looking at his girlfriend who he was not able to keep because he was too focused on his own acquisition of wealth, looking at his employee Bob and Tiny Tim Cratchit, who may not live without intervention, and then looking at no one coming to a funeral for him and people picking over his possessions after he dies, he understands that humanity is more important than wealth. And humanity means, I'm gonna quote Spider-Man here, with great power comes great responsibility. And Scrooge realizes that he has a responsibility to those around them simply because they are human beings. And he says that from now on, he will keep Christmas in his heart. He will live in the past, the present, and the future. And I think that we have seen this story so many times in so many forms that I think sometimes we tend to forget what an amazing story it really is and what Charles Dickens was saying to the people who had money in Victorian England. Because Dickens was born into not great circumstances, and he did work in workhouses when he was a kid. And he was basically looking around at the people who were by his side when he was younger and saying, these people are being left out of society for no other reason than the people who have wealth are not doing things to help. And that story just kind of like lives on and lives on and lives on. But there's also, when does a hero become a villain? My example this is sort of the opposite of a redemption arc, and the character that I picked out is Syndrome from The Incredibles, the first movie, right? He wants nothing other than to be a hero. He wants nothing other than to be a sidekick to Mr. Incredible. And Mr. Incredible says, "Kid, I don't have time for you." And Syndrome, because of this, decides he's going to be a villain instead. And everything is going to be about him taking aim at and taking out all of the supers. And then at the very end, after he's eliminated all of them, selling all of his stuff so that anyone can be super. And his final thing in his monologue is, when everyone is super, no one will be super. And that's sort of his plan. So it's interesting that we can see kind of going one direction, the Zuko direction, or the Scrooge direction, and one trajectory going the other way. What causes you to fall from being a hero into being a villain? And all of that happens because of the narratives that we are caught in. So, Avery, we've spent a lot of time defining heroes and villains, sort of looking at why we play them, why we're interested in them, and maybe we can talk a little bit now about what are the stories that they are embedded in.
Yeah, the quote that Syndrome says relates a lot to the show The Boys, which is a world in which the superheroes all have the most societal power, and it shows that that power can eventually corrupt them and turn the quote unquote superheroes into the actual villains of the story. I haven't seen much beyond the first episode because it's actually quite a bloody show, but it does put a spin on the narrative that we have around superheroes. Like, are you a superhero just because you have the powers that comes along with it, or are you a hero because you're actually a good, not corrupt person? The show Invincible, which is animated, I mentioned earlier, features Omni-Man, who's the planet's most powerful superhero, who's from another planet. He has an origin story that seems similar to that of Superman, but it's actually, spoiler alert, it's actually revealed that Omni-Man is secretly on Earth so that his alien race can conquer the Earth, usually destroying every single weak being on it. Like, his species' motto or whatever is that all the weak must be destroyed, only the strongest survive. And so Mark Grayson, who is the son of Omni-Man and a human woman, voiced by Sandra Oh, oh my gosh, Mark Grayson is developing his own superpowers as a young adult, and he has to decide whether to save the Earth from his father or join his father in destroying the human race. It is a it's quite a bloody animated show, and it is just very raw and grounded in the way that it confronts this question of what truly makes a superhero. And it also questions a lot of the tropes that we find in a lot of comic book superheroes and all those kinds of movies and such. The show Interior Chinatown, I've watched recently on Hulu. It's based off of a book by Charles Yu, and Charles Yu also created the show too. Features Willis Wu, who is a background character stuck in a police procedural called Black and White. One day, he accidentally witnesses a crime, and then he investigates and starts to uncover family secrets in a Chinatown criminal underground while learning how it feels to be in the spotlight. So the question is, what is it like to be a generic Asian background character? And then what is it like once you're thrust into an actual spotlight role afterwards? And the rules of this world in the show are so interesting. Like, Willis, he's literally locked out of certain doors or paths. Like, he cannot open the front door of the police precinct because he's just a background character. But once he dresses up and fulfills the expectations of the world, where he's either a Chinese food delivery boy or a quote-unquote tech guy once he just puts on some glasses, or he's a translator, he has to disrupt this world enough that he becomes a main character detective and that the other main characters actually see him. Like, the main police detectives, Green and Turner, they don't see him at all until he disrupts the world enough. And the world revolves around these two main detectives, but literally the lighting changes. It's so beautiful. Like, these two characters walk in pompously, the lights change to like a purple blue, and then the show like revolves around them like it's a typical, CSI whatever. And then they walk out of the scene, those lights change back to their like dull yellow, and then you get to see what Willis is up to again. But like, there's so many scenes where where Willis, this Asian male character, he's like waving his hands in front of the main detectives. He's like in the background, like trying to get into the scene, and like the camera it just doesn't center around him, and he's just completely invisible. And it's such an amazing example that I related to so much as an Asian person of like, what does Hollywood see in us as human beings, basically? Like, what is the expendability of certain characters based on your race? And like, what agency do you really have in a world that doesn't really even want to look at you? And it can explain a lot as to, like, I can understand why if Willis were to become a villain, I could totally understand why. And if he were to try to become a hero, I can also understand why too. Like, I think the origin story of being in this type of world itself is enough for me to relate to like wanting to take action and wanting to take charge, because I related so much to like just not being seen as a person. Like, how I related to Violet from The Incredibles is like, I relate so much to the nature of being invisible, and I feel so empowered when I see these characters taking action and not becoming invisible anymore, or using this invisibility to gain some power and gain some agency in this world.
I love Interior Chinatown. Oh my gosh, Jimmy O Yang. I That guy is so funny. And I just had this kind of minor epiphany, which was I was talking about Indiana Jones before. So in the second movie of the original trilogy, he has Short Round, portrayed by Ke Huy Quan, right? And as a kid. And so you look at this kid playing, and Quan was also in the Goonies. You look at this kid playing sort of a sidekick character or a character who's outside the spotlight or the limelight. Then years later, we get Everything Everywhere All at Once. And he is now the hero, and he wins an Oscar, and Quan wins an Oscar for playing this role. And it is so fascinating, like the idea that this kid, when he was a kid, got these specific roles. And then as an Asian American actor, Quan was sort of struggling when he was in his young adulthood and even like in his 30s. And then suddenly he gets this chance to be in this quirky little, not really indie, but almost quasi indie movie. And he just, I come on, Michelle Yeoh. Oh my God.
Absolutely.
All those guys are just absolutely amazing. All four of the main actors are amazing. And he gets to be in this movie where suddenly, just like Interior Chinatown, he is now the hero. And so now he is seen. And Quan is now in all this different stuff. So I just kind of made that connection with Indiana Jones from before.
Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I know. I love that guy. All of these narratives, if we look at the work of Joseph Campbell, who was working sort of in the mid-century, and he was a guy who looked at comparative mythology and looked at myths and tales from around the world, tried to understand whether they had common elements. And he found that they did. And so his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, was sort of about, he had what he called a monomyth, which is sort of like the basic structure of a story or the hero's journey. And there's some really interesting stuff here. I mean, the cultural differences are, of course, as important as the foundational similarities. But he looked at all the similarities, including the hero, what the hero is expected to do, what the hero's journey does, what it means. And he looked at it across a number of different cultures. And my goodness, everything from sort of, folk tales or fairy tales to religious stories. So religious heroes, kings, queens, warriors, prophets, teachers, healers, all these different characters who display heroism and what their journeys mean. And that influenced probably thousands of writers after that idea came out, because if the basic idea, Avery, I think, was if something is working, keep doing it, right? And so Lucas, of course, was inspired. All kinds of people who were doing sort of hero's journey stuff were inspired. And it also caused people to question, I think, the idea of a hero, like you were talking about with The Boys, the comic series and movie and show The Watchmen, the idea of who watches the Watchmen, which was graffiti in an ancient society. Who people that we put in power, is there anyone who's empowered to take away their power if they misuse it? That idea. Do we trust heroes? And in Dune, Paul Atreides, what happens when the chosen one is not really a good guy, and when he gets all this chosen one power, if he uses it in the wrong way, and what happens when his followers get out of hand? So we've now seen the Villeneuve Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, and we can see Paul taking power and basically cutting everyone else out, and then his followers going a little bit maybe past simple veneration and into a kind of zealotry. And what is that going to mean? And then what happens when a hero thinks just because they have certain traits they know what's good and right? The white savior problem. A white hero saves weaker minority characters. We have seen this time and time and time again. And we now have the new Interview with the Vampire streaming series. And oh my gosh, shout out to my sister Brooke Hero, because Hero? Oh my gosh, that was a Freudian slip. Shout out to my sister Brooke here, because she got me into the show. And the original story was about the vampire Lestat, who is a Frenchman, and the vampire Louis. And in Anne Rice's novels, Louis is a plantation owner and owns enslaved people. And the streaming show changed that to Louis being a Creole man of color in the early 1900s. So we're done with slavery, and now we're looking at Storyville in New Orleans. And he is a guy who has financial success with things like bars and things like bordellos. And Lestat comes in and loves Louis, and essentially says, Louis, I am going to turn you into a vampire because I love you. I want you to be immortal, and I want you to have powers that you, as a man of color, do not have in this world of New Orleans in the 10s and 20s, 1910s, 1920s. And the idea of helping him by turning him ends up affecting Louis's life in ways that are horrible. And so it totally turns the white savior trope on its head. And it's more interesting and layered, I think, because of that. And so that's kind of looking at how stories affect heroes and how heroes are in their stories, whether it's a monomyth or whether it's interior Chinatown. But Avery also looking at how villains are affected by their stories. So we'll go back to Wicked for a second. What does it mean when you suddenly are thrust into the role of being a villain? When simply because of your circumstances and because you are living out your version of heroism, you become the villain. And no one mourns the wicked, right? Is what the villagers sing. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. What happens when you are created not as a monster, but as a companion, and then you become monstrous? We talked about this in the monster episode. But what happens simply because you are created, you are cast as the villain. And I think that's sort of fascinating as well. How much at the mercy of your story are you?
If there's anything that narrative and play teaches us, is that nothing here that we've talked about is really black and white.
Yeah.
The dichotomy between heroes and villains and everything in between is just all such a matter of circumstances, internal things that you're born with, and what the creators of the story deem. And one thing that I hope that our listeners take away, and that anybody who grows up with these stories takes away, is that there's always a side of the story that you're not seeing and that you're not focused on right now.
Yeah.
With the situation of heroes in real life, I mean, we are taught that, heroes are good, great people, they always do good, and that's like a one-dimensional view of them. But as we've discussed with like society and the government and the way our country is structured and how authority comes to even be, as a child, I was always taught to respect people in positions of authority automatically. Like, don't question them. Like, they are there for a reason. They probably got a degree, they got their badge, they got their certification, their training. They're a good person if they're a person in authority. And that was just a very simple way of just being kind of taught to go along with things as a kid. But as an adult and learning more about how the world works, I mean, I used to want to be a spy as a kid. Like, I was like, oh, I want to join the CIA later and, like, do cool things and do what they do in the cartoons and stuff. But now I don't even want to consider being involved in any of the shady stuff that our government does on a daily basis. And like some examples of the people that we see as heroes can be like doctors or police or soldiers and people in the army. But I mean, once you look deeper into the statistics behind these things, the real raw stories behind all these kinds of people, I mean, doctors, they can exacerbate misogyny by dismissing or misdiagnosing female patients time and time again in huge patterns that, people publish articles about. Like with the police, they can be part of disproportionate violence against black and brown people. They're the ones who are getting funded more above any of our education systems, and not to mention, they are not the best people to have around during a mental health crisis. And then soldiers who, all over the world, they can be advertised and sold as heroes and be like, yeah, well, go fight these people for us and you'll come home a hero or whatnot, or you'll die a hero. But eventually they can just become tools for genocide and just become people who actually enjoy causing the pain that they're being told to cause. And I don't want our stories to continue to perpetuate the idea of heroes and villains being black and white, because if we perpetuate that message, then people in reality are going to perpetuate that message as well.
Yeah. And the LAPD, LA Police Department, on all of its police vehicles, which are ironically black and white, has to protect and to serve, right? That was the motto of the LAPD that was developed and is now used by a lot of different police departments around the country. And it kind of goes back to that very, very first Greek definition of our protectors, our defenders, and people who, I guess, are expected to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. And that narrative does often get called into question. And there's this joke or this meme, not all heroes wear capes, right? And so we'll see like somebody did something goofy and they made somebody smile, but it was not really heroic, but we're kind of saying that it was heroic. And I love that that was kind of a thing. It also goes to Edna Mode in The Incredibles. No capes, darling, no capes, right? The idea is if you wear a cape, you are vulnerable to attack and you are vulnerable to danger. And so I kind of love the idea that what is a cape? Does a cape or a mask always indicate a hero? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Remember during the pandemic when all of us were masked and some of us maybe felt like old West sort of what would they be like? Outlaws. That's the word I was looking for. Outlaws. Yeah. I've got a mask. You can't tell who I am, kind of thing. And that was sort of interesting. The mask that the Dread Pirate Roberts wears in Princess Bride to hide his identity. The whole idea of a mask hiding your identity, but also helping you become a different identity. You are Batman. You are not Bruce Wayne because you currently have the cape and the cowl, that sort of thing. Really interesting to think about, and how playful we can be when we are thinking about who we want our heroes to be, the people in our real lives who we want to be heroes. So I wanted to bring up a famous speech from Richard III, so quickly going back to villain before we sort of wrap things up here. Richard III says, when he is explaining to the audience why he is going to be the villain of this play you are going to watch, he says, "Why I in this weak piping time of peace have no delight to pass away the time, unless to see my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days." He's not going to be a good guy. He's not a soldier anymore. He has to adjust to peacetime. And he has become a symbol of this sort of unformed or not well-formed idea that Shakespeare has given him, right? And because he has sort of this monstrous, I suppose, aspect of him that he talks about, he cannot be a lover, and so he has no choice except to become a villain. And he tells us, you're gonna watch me kill my family, you're gonna watch me sort of become the person with the most power, but never forget that I am the villain. And the idea of, do we understand why villainy is what it is? And if so, can we do something about it? And the last little thing that I wanted to mention was Tina Turner has this song in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. She has this song and she's backed up by all these kids who are sort of captive in this space. And for years and years and years, the kids and the Tina Turner character have hoped that a hero will come and rescue them. And it's just not working out, Avery. It just is not a thing. And so she has this amazing song called We Don't Need Another Hero. And rest in peace, Tina. Oh my gosh. She sang the heck out of this song. But the song was basically her and the kids saying, we've had enough heroes. We need to try and figure out a way to do this ourselves. We, the common people, have just about had enough of heroes coming in here and telling us that they can do something for us and not succeeding. It's time for us to step forward and not even call ourselves heroes, but find some kind of strength in our common cause and the fact that everybody has something that they can contribute to freedom and to equality and all those things that we say that heroes want and we say as a society that we want. So, Avery, that's what I got.
That's absolutely amazing as usual. Thank you so much, Drew. We could embody the, oh yeah, I'm not doing this just for myself. I'm doing this for the greater good. And
Exactly.
that's something that we always have to remember as we go out into the world. So, who are you, as Uncle Ira would say? Who are you, Prince Zuko? And what do you really want for yourself and for society? This has been Powered by Play with Avery and Drew. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you can support us online at Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/poweredbyplay. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.